Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to my video about state secrets and secret states of quantum computing. If you want to make sure that a person or a quantum computer is telling you the truth, you either have to convince them that you already know the truth and that you have information that could hurt them, or you might have the person or quantum computer record what it plans to do and then check that it did what it said it was going to do. This was the great epiphany on which a graduate student named Urmila Mahadev spent almost a decade of her life. The reason that it took her so long to have this epiphany was that she needed to figure out how to say these things in a coded academic language that would be very difficult for non-specialists to parse. She had a computer that could calculate something, but she had no way to know if it had calculated that something correctly, because there were no other computers that could perform the calculation in a verifiable way. Her computer could perform the calculation 1,000,000 times and get the same answer each time. But that isn't the same thing as knowing that the answer calculated is correct. Her job was to convince everyone that there was a way to be sure that the answer was correct. She did this by convincing herself and others that if you perform a calculation with a known outcome in parallel with a calculation with an unknown outcome, a correct result from the known outcome calculation will validate the result from the unknown outcome calculation. I must admit that I'm not entirely sure that I believe her result. Can you really be sure that a quantum computer delivered a correct result for an unknown calculation? I don't think you can, and I don't believe that she solved the problem she set out to solve 10 years ago. I think she just formalized and encrypted the statement of the problem and solution in a language that was sufficiently complex to trick people into believing that the problem had been solved. She wrote a proof by tedious complexity which, incidentally, might be good enough to solve a real problem that needs to be solved. How do we convince the world that the government has the world's most powerful encryption tools? How do we convince the world that resistance is futile? I congratulate her for her perseverance or perseverance. The educational system is designed to break your mind, and the fact that it took almost 10 years for them to break her ability to think or communicate like a normal person should make her parents proud. She has learned to speak in a quantum academic code and lost her ability to use plain speech. In other words, she has learned how to say things in a way that will be indecipherable to most people, even in some cases to herself. At the end of this breaking process, many a young physicist will not even realize that he or she has become indecipherable. Those who have not undergone this process of encryption or indoctrination have usually retained their ability to think in an uncoded, clear, rational fashion. To them, it requires no lengthy proof to see that the best way to encrypt something is to bury the message in irrelevant noise and to use extended euphemisms that require special cultural knowledge to decode. I believe that the journalist who wrote the article about Dr. Mahadev was well versed in that form of encryption because his article read a bit like an extended euphemism. Of course, to those who lack the ability to think about things figuratively, anyone who insists that something is a euphemism will be seen as crazy. Therein lies the power of this form of encryption. It has built-in plausible deniability, unlike a code in which the speakers simply randomly misspell words here and there to mess up a data miner's ability to extract meaning. I believe that the journalist at Quantum magazine indirectly told readers with the proper cultural context, or decryption keys, that the power of the quantum computer is not in what it can actually do. It is in the threat of what it can do. In many ways, it is like the Star Wars space program. If you are not up to date on your history, the US military convinced Russia that it was building free electron lasers in space so that it could shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles. This program was called Star Wars. And from what I heard, Russia bought the bluff, and this somehow changed the course of history. Of course, that was the US narrative of the early 90s. I'm sure that Russia's narrative would be quite different. Today, we have a quantum computing community that claims the ability to use 53 qubits to perform an unverifiable quantum calculation over and over, a ridiculous number of times, while getting the same answer each and every time. The calculation itself has no known applications, but it supposedly would have taken a conventional computer 10,000 years to complete this calculation. They plan to scale this system up to thousands of qubits without knowing how they would use a system, supposedly. This brings us back to the topic of Dr. Mahadev's thesis. If you can't verify the results of these computations, how can you be sure that the calculation was correct, even if it was done thousands of times and that it got the same result thousands of times? If there was a mistake anywhere in the chain of logic, the answer would still be wrong. But Dr. Mahadev believes that if you embed a verifiable calculation, like 1 + 1 = 2, within the unverifiable calculation, then the unverifiable calculation will be verified because of how complexly interdependent the unverifiable calculation is. I'm not entirely sure about that. I suppose that you could have a network of quantum computers that all know the right answer and check one another, but that doesn't change the fact that we wouldn't know the right answer, and we would have no idea if the computation was of anything that has any connection to objective reality. If the result has no connection to objective reality, it cannot be used, for example, for physics calculations or for simulations of economics or social dynamics. If you've read my earlier piece on quantum computing, you'll understand my skepticism about the usefulness of the method. A system that can only compute simulations of itself isn't terribly useful. Then again, isn't that what a conscious being is doing all of the time? Maybe a network of quantum computers that evolves in response to a threat might serve a purpose, but that calls to mind some rather frightening science fiction scenarios. Anyone in academia knows that students are trained to encrypt their knowledge so that they can communicate with a community of elites while excluding the regular people with their jargon. Once a student has demonstrated adequate encryption skills, he or she might be allowed into the room with the elders of the community. But even then, they have to toe the party line. Since my experience has been limited to that of government research labs, I wonder if this behavior is unique to the community of scientists. I certainly see this behavior within the community of data scientists, through their use of Bayesian statistics instead of more transparent frequentist analysis. But is this opacity in the interest of society? Protecting non-democratically elected enclaves of power isn't always in the public interest, because it prevents the system from self-correcting, and it might necessitate dismantling of the enclaves when they become too powerful. The worst events in human history have stemmed from fearful people in powerful enclaves who have a vision of the world which is warped beyond belief. When, through their fear-warped vision, they see a flawed system and a world heading for destruction, they may be inclined to set the world on fire so that they may start with a clean slate and realize their twisted dream of reshaping the world in some ideal image. When this happens, mass murder or suffering has typically followed. History has shown us that the ends do not justify the means, and these fearful people's choices operate according to zero-sum rules that do not benefit humanity as a whole. I find this especially dangerous when these enclaves start to believe in simulations that have never demonstrated predictive power. It's quite concerning. I didn't finish watching a video of a couple of guys chatting on a podcast called The Portal, but it was a guy named Daniel Schmucktenberger and Eric Weinstein. But Schmucktenberger's statement that the world was designed to hold 500 million people, it sent chills up my spine. I mean, there are almost 8 billion people in the world. And if he really believes that, and if he had the power to make something like that happen, he could, start a movement that would be destructive. If someone with power truly believed that the world was designed to hold 500 million people and engineered a plague to bring those conditions about, let's just say that every atrocity in human history would pale in comparison. And when I see people who have money and power thinking in those sorts of ways, it makes me wish for a belief in a higher power to make a resurgence. It's just so arrogant to think that if a group of people thinks that they know what's best for the planet, what is the planet in this sense? And where did they get their idea that it's designed to hold 500 million people? This is why I wish for people like Dr. Mahadev to be broken free from their academic trances so that they can avoid becoming a cog in a machine of destruction and oppression, and so that they can see what their leaders are really thinking about the future and help them achieve a less fearful perspective. So non-deities like me and Dr. Mahadev are trained to absorb complexes of ideas, and this was what school was all about, and we are told that they will give us superpowers which will allow us to make a contribution to civilization. And what is sad is that in most cases this is not true. This absorption of these idea complexes is usually a pointless exercise that makes many people quite miserable. I was honestly most miserable when I was studying physics. I would go to bed every night wishing for an earthquake that would bring the world crashing down around me so that I could walk out into the world as a free person. It was only decades later, after disengaging from this system, that I saw how it was designed by fearful people who wanted to absorb the attention of young people that they feared. They were afraid that young people would do something disruptive, and they told themselves that the encryption fostered by the system was the medicine that the system needed to survive. But I get the sense that they were so blinded by their fear that they could not see the ways in which they were creating a poisonous environment that aggravated the condition they sought to cure. So I'm not sure about all of this, but this was my gut reaction to reading the article about quantum encryption today. I hope you found it interesting and that it inspired you to do your own thinking, because I think that's what we really need, is for people to limit the time they spent in myopic pursuits and to try to look up and see the greater connections around them and how they can strengthen those connections. I mean, there are old ways that this has been done in history through various religions, where that makes people feel connected to something larger than themselves, so that they're not so afraid that they do something destructive. And I think that's probably what the world needs. I know that, I'm fully aware of conflicts that arise due to religion, that people fight over religions, but that's not necessary. It's never been necessary. And it's also not necessary for people to feel threatened by people who connect to one another. And, it makes you feel lonely if everybody else is gathered together and feeling connected and you're not. We need to create something open and something that embraces all of the people who've been studying grains of sand with their heads in the sand, hiding in fear. When they pull their heads up out of the sand, they need to be supported. And I guess that's really why I'm writing my books. And, I write the novels, I write the popular science book, and they're all kind of aimed in that direction. Just a sense that the emotional journey I have taken might be helpful to somebody else who has to do the same thing, so that they don't stumble and fall and hurt themselves or others. So it's a bit arrogant and ambitious to think that you can do that, but I think everybody should try whatever they can do to encourage a sense of connectedness that reduces fear. Fear is, we should all be less fearful. Fear is the enemy in all things, really. So, thank you for watching, and please tune in to my next videos. They are on all sorts of topics, and I hope that there will be something that you connect to that inspires you.